In the spirit of the new films from Denis Villeneuve, which seek to capture the essence of Dune, I was so inspired seeing the peak bald representation on screen that I thought, fuck it, I'm shearing it off. Today I'm going to be talking about Dune by Frank Herbert. No Moby Dick this month. I thought Dune would be more than sufficient to cover my library's monthly theme of a book featuring an animal because the sandworms are a pretty integral component of this book. I will get around to Moby Dick at one point. I just have so much on my plate at the current moment. The label's starting to really pick up steam, and I've got a whole bunch of other book reviews that I need to get out for you guys, so Moby Dick eventually. I received this copy of Dune as a Christmas present back in, I think, like 2022. I had managed to avoid seeing the 2021 film adaptation up until the release of Part 2. And since I had plans to go see that movie with a friend of mine, and I had yet to crack open my present, I thought, shit, perfect time to actually read Dune. Having been aware of the 1984 botched adaptation by David Lynch, as well as the very fascinating documentary about Alejandro Jodorowsky's attempt to realize this work in Jodorowsky's Dune, a documentary that I would totally recommend you watch, it has taken me way too long to actually read this classic work of science fiction. Having just come out of this novel, I am pretty much in consensus with the majority. This is a classic, super influential, especially if you're a fan of science fiction, and not even just science fiction within this medium. This clearly went on to inspire things like Star Wars, etc., or was at least the seed of lots of ideas present in more prominent science fiction works to come after the fact. Not only science fiction though, but I also feel fantasy too. Dune is set primarily on the desert planet of Arrakis, the family Atreides having recently inherited control of this planet from the Harkonnens, one that is very difficult to maintain control over due to the unsparing environment and the violent sandworms that roam its deserts, but one that is also highly sought after because it is the sole source of spice in the universe. A valuable resource kind of tantamount to oil that makes interstellar travel possible. Herbert employs a lot of new terms specific to the culture that has developed on Arrakis, that of the Fremen, people who have been able to survive despite its harsh conditions. A lot of these terms are either analogs or references to pre-existing terms and concepts, specifically within Arabic and Islamic cultures. This futuristic society seems kind of centered around the export of this spice, and thus the planet of Arrakis is not only one that is dangerous for its setting, but one that serves as the stage for much political intrigue, deception, betrayal, and revenge. We follow Paul of House Atreides, son of the Duke Leto, trying to salvage what has been left for them by the Harkonnens, who have left Arrakis in a really disastrous and poorly equipped state for their aims of spice production. Of note as well is Paul's mother Jessica, a member of the Bene Gesserit, a group of women, kind of a shadowy organization who have been able to train their body and minds to perform almost like supernatural feats, like being able to control people with a word, also being able to change their biochemistry. Other interesting things like that is where there's a bit of mystique to the world of Dune, where it kind of veers into this almost fantastical dimension. So that is the general setup of the plot of Dune, and in order for me to talk about it, I've got to divulge spoilers, so here's your warning. Also, you're going to see the lighting in this setup shift from time to time. It took me 2 recording sessions to get this review finalized. This is one of my longer discussions, having come really fresh out of both the book and these 2 movies. I have a lot of thoughts that I want to try to capture. It has a lot of subjects it's taking on all at once. There's clearly at the core of this novel an ecological message about the preservation of our natural world. It has a lot to say on the feudal system, the stratification of class. It is subtly critical of the advancement of technology, this world having outlawed thinking machines, artificial intelligence, as well as atomic weapons, and there's certainly a contrast spelled out between those who use shields and have all of this technology to mine spice and the sort of minimalist lifestyles of the Fremen. There's commentary on eugenics in this novel as well, along with everything else it's handling. While Dune tackles a myriad of subjects, it does so in a format that is pretty familiar and easy to jump into. Something that really surprised me going into this novel is just how, like, totally readable it is. There wasn't much of a barrier for entry, I found at least. I think some people might actually find it too direct. Some people might take issue with the point of view, which is constantly shifting to the internal narrative of its many characters within the same chapter. You get to know everything that's happening, insofar as the characters at least know what's happening. You'll have characters talking with one another in the same scene, and not only will you have their back and forth verbally, but then in like italics you'll have each of those characters' respective internal responses to the shifting dynamic of the conversation, how subtle facial reactions, intonation of voice communicate a lot, and it makes these exchanges really exciting to read. There are still things left unspoken though. There is still intrigue, though there is a really compelling world drawn here, one of the most fleshed out I've encountered, and one that feels really considered and internally consistent. I was surprised to find that Dune really doesn't contain too many visual descriptions of its world. The real emphasis of this novel are the characters and how they interact with one another, the shifting loyalties, shifting perspectives, and ever-changing power dynamic. A downside of this style is that Herbert can be a little too direct at points and reuse phrases again and again to an obvious degree. For instance, there is an attempt on Paul's life. It really heavily weighs on his father, who throughout his whole chapter just has this, "They tried to kill my son, they tried to kill my son," repeated over and over again. The clear intent here is to illustrate that despite everything that's been going on in this scene, the one enduring emotional response of the Duke is that he's afraid for the life of his son, and the anger resulting from that, and the paranoia. Paul, who becomes aware of his like messianic role within this story, realizes that it's him actually fulfilling this grand, terrible purpose, this vague thing. He won't say what's so terrible about it because he doesn't quite even know yet himself. All he knows is it's a terrible purpose, and you're gonna hear that repeated a whole bunch. As well as the phrase desert power, which I thought was more than anything just very, very funny. Like it's some element that you can wield. It's desert power, wind power, sea power. It occasionally overspells what is actually happening and can be redundant. Only occasionally though. Otherwise, this is a tremendously well-written book. This omniscient style is really, really cool and makes everything we're reading feel important, distinct within what I've read too. Usually when reading a novel, you have to fill in the gaps. Here you just get everything, and it's just so refreshing. It demonstrates a real empathy for like all of his characters. Take the character of Yue, the betrayer within the Atreides family, turning off the shields of the planet so that the Harkonnens can invade and slaughter the Atreides. Yue's motivations are rooted in his love for his wife, who has been captured and is being tortured, assumedly, by the Harkonnens. And so his betrayal of the Atreides, and also his attempts to undermine the Harkonnens within his own betrayal, is this really empathetic drawing of a traitor character. Despite his pivotal role being a negative one that you feel really bad for. The Harkonnens, they feel very villainous, like pretty outright, especially the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Frank even goes to such lengths as to call him gross and fat in basically every chapter he's in. There are a couple of lines thrown in here, omitted from the films. He asks that his boys be properly drugged because he doesn't want a wrestling match. That was a really nasty line. That is not to say that the Atreides are necessarily painted in an entirely flattering light either. A lot more compelling than just an outright virtuous hero. That feeds directly into one of the greatest, if not I think the greatest thematic statement of this book, as concerns the idea of a messiah, and how that can be a very dangerous thing to play into. Herbert has designed a world where prophecy and the political power that religion lends benefit the Bene Gesserit. The primary religion on Arrakis is one that was invented, essentially, by the Bene Gesserit, such that if one of their members happens to get trapped on this planet, they'll be able to survive relying on their understanding of the inner workings mysteries of the faith and the prophecy of the Lisan al-Gaib. From everything I've heard, the sequel to this novel, Dune, Messiah, actually explores this theme even more so. But I think if you're able to interpret the text correctly, like if you actually read the book and understand what is being said, what the Bene Gesserit do to the Fremen, instilling them with this like false hope for someone who will be able to liberate them and bring a green paradise to Arrakis. This is a very sinister thing. Paul eventually becomes this Lisan al-Gaib. They have had to manipulate an entire culture of people, take advantage of their resources, their numbers, their knowledge of Arrakis, in order for them to get revenge. I think it's in the smaller moments where we see what Paul and Jessica have done to these people psychologically. There's a really wonderful line by Herbert near the end of the novel that perfectly illustrates this idea. There's a character named Stilgar who is a leader among the Fremen who grows to know Paul. They develop this years-long friendship and trust in one another. But by the end of the novel, Paul has transformed as a character and acquired this sort of prescient memory, which I will talk about a lot more. We get this line. In that instant, Paul saw how Stilgar had been transformed from the Fremen Naib to a creature of the Lisan al-Gaib, a receptacle for awe and obedience. It was a lessening of the man, and Paul felt the ghost wind of the jihad in it. I have seen a friend become a worshipper, he thought. Herbert carefully constructs this arc of Paul's from a teenager who has been trained by his mother in the ways of the Bene Gesserit. He's also been trained, in a sense, to become a mentat, which is a person who has a mind that works almost as like a computer. They're able to process things very adeptly. They're kind of like the strategic advisors of a lot of people in power. To someone who sheds part of their own humanity, more a symbol than a man. And that trajectory is not pitched as something desirable or noble at all. The contrast between the Fremen way of life and the life that Paul knew prior is illustrated quite well and presents different value sets for us to consider, especially in contrast to the ways of the Harkonnens. For instance, there is a duel between Paul and a Fremen named Jamis. In order for Paul to be properly accepted within the Fremen tribe, he has to kill Jamis. He incites the Amtal, which is this term where you take something to its logical extreme. And so when he and Jamis come into conflict, the Amtal cites that they must fight it out to the death. Paul has been trained in fighting in regards to having a shield. This outer membrane fast-moving objects cannot penetrate, but slower, more deceptive attacks are able to deal blows. Jamis, never having had a shield, having to live on this planet, he has had to learn how to fight in a way that does not have this restraint in just a still suit. Another really cool science fiction concept. The concepts in this book are fucking awesome. Still suits recycle one's water, water being incredibly precious on this world, almost like a commodity in and of itself. Shedding a tear for the dead is seen as this great act. The same thing is done with spitting, you know, something that's seen as a great act of disrespect in our culture is actually a sign of reverence. I'm sacrificing some of my precious water to honor our exchange here. And so Paul and Jamis coming to blows is this very tense sequence because Paul has to quickly unlearn how he was raised and has to adapt in this moment of violent conflict in order to survive. Once Paul defeats Jamis, the way that the Fremen revere and honor and grieve for their dead is explicitly detailed in the coming chapters. One Fremen dying is given great significance. The conflict between the Atreides and the Harkonnens results in many, many dead soldiers who are nameless and end up just being corpses in a funeral pyre. Jamis, this character who is kind of just antagonistic to Paul, is treated with dignity, and Paul is set to inherit the family that Jamis left behind. Kind of emphasizing that within Fremen culture, valuing of one another, not just as resources and instruments for survival, but as people, as companions, is really important. James Cameron's Avatar wishes it could fucking be this story. The contrast of the Fremen culture is also an interesting contrast, literally, of just environment. The danger of the planet is something that needs to be very consciously and constantly acknowledged and respected. The sandworms that roam the planet are a constant threat, and so navigation of the desert has to be done in this style that does not mimic a consistent pattern that the worm can recognize and follow. Technology like thumpers have been developed to redirect worms away from the Fremen navigating the desert. Shields are actually highly inadvisable in this context because they summon a worm. There's a really exciting sequence, one not present in the Villeneuve films, where Paul's mother falls into a dune. The shifting of the sand has essentially trapped her, and so Paul has to very delicately get her out. Even the smallest moments where there's not even a worm present are really gripping. For my money, though, the most interesting thing drawn in this unique setting is spice. Spice is integral to intergalactic travel because it gains foresight into the future and allows people navigating space to find the correct path. One of the most gripping sequences to read was when Paul first comes into contact with the spice after a crash landing in the desert. Someone who has been trained in the ways of the Bene Gesserit and hyper-awareness and intense calculation, him never having touched the stuff prior, gets a full dose of it with total dread and complete prescient awareness, sees the path laid before him, one that ultimately will end in jihad. The language Herbert uses in this moment is incredible to me and is probably my favorite part of the book as concerns actual writing style, because we get that directness, right? But it's filtered through this abstract, psychedelic, time-spanning consciousness. Somehow it's totally clear what it is that Frank is saying, and this plays into the style of Dune, I think, perfectly well. Frank wants us to know what everyone is thinking and saying and feeling. Paul and his prescience gives us even more understanding of not only what is happening in the present moment, but how it's going to tie into what is going to happen at the end of this book. Some people might take issue with that because they think, well, where's the surprise, right? And to that I would say the real joy of Dune, the unique appeal, is knowing the end destination in its broad contour, right? We don't know specifically, and neither does Paul, because his vision is not all-encompassing, of course. He doesn't become this god being right away. The dread of reaching that finality, knowing every step of the way that this is a predetermined essential course, this narrow band of history that you have to live out. Even subtle, more beautiful moments where Paul is finding respite from his ultimate course and enjoying life with his wife Chani. You know, even in those moments, that this is just a lull. This is not to last. This moment will be ashes upon the end of the book. Jessica has to become what is called a Reverend Mother. Bene Gesserit who keep the memories of previous Reverend Mothers within them and rely upon their wisdom and counsel and consciousness. In order to become a Reverend Mother, you must take in the water of life, which is produced by a drowned sandworm. Toxic to anyone who drinks it without having the abilities of a Bene Gesserit to chemically alter the substance within themselves. In Jessica's situation, she's pregnant. Taking in this water of life imbues her unborn fetus with this vast consciousness. This concept was one of the craziest fucking things to read. Beautifully and horrifically communicated in Herbert's prose. And this is something that only the David Lynch adaptation so far has had the balls to execute in cinematic form. This 4-year-old little girl who is able to speak as an adult and who has this prescience that Paul also has. In leaning into the logical extent of prophecy and omniscience, imagine that in the context of something so innocent as a little girl. She's a child that is kind of ostracized even within Fremen culture. Aaliyah is referred to as Aaliyah the Strange. And there's a really fucked up moment at the end of the book where she goes around killing out of this sort of innocent desire to just help them out. Super fucked. So I think Dune's most lasting and insightful and daring comment has to do with the role of prophecy and its dangers and its perverting effects. But Dune is also a compelling journey of characters. Characters who are really well drawn, all of the central characters having really interesting arcs. Arcs that are occasionally quite unpredictable, sad, poetic, and in some cases a little unsatisfying. And here's where I want to talk about them in the context of the new Denis Villeneuve films, films and how they are superior largely to the movies, but how in other ways the Villeneuve movies have made some keen decisions. Paul is very attached to three characters: Thufir Hawat, Gurney Halleck, and Duncan Idaho, each of them serving as mentors to him, and all of them having some sort of unceremonious quality as concerns their arc play out in the book. Thufir Hawat, the mentat of the Atreides, is spared by the Harkonnens in the attack on Arrakis to become Baron Vladimir Harkonnen's own mentat. Thufir, being unquestionably loyal to the Atreides, has a clear distaste for his new role abetting the Harkonnens, set up as an assassin in the very final moment of the book to get close to Paul and kill him with a poison needle, a gum jabbar. He rejects his role and ends up killing himself. Thufir's arc, I feel, could have been retooled in a way that emphasized him a little bit more. His conflict with Jessica, his suspicion that she is actually the one who will betray the family. I do understand why his role was de-emphasized, but having him present in the first film and not in the second is just kind of strange to me. He almost seems like a vestigial character of the book, one whose role could have been sort of merged with other characters in order to create more of a coherent arc. And then we have Duncan Idaho, who dies in a way that I think is almost hilariously and intentionally unceremonious. Duncan's death, pitched in the film, is like supposed to be this real tragic sacrifice. Paul is so much more a calculating and emotionally controlled character in the book that when Duncan dies for them so that they can get away, Paul doesn't think twice about it and just keeps moving. The film emphasizing Duncan's death as this sort of martyrdom. It's an attempt to give them this big Hollywood moment, this slow motion tragic sequence, because they also need a climax for the end of the first part of these two movies, and I guess Duncan Idaho's death is kind of significant, right? The casting of Gurney Halleck is quite strong. Brolin does do well with the material he's given. His family was killed by the Beast Raban, and he was left with an inkvine scar on his cheek, his most distinct characteristic. He is marked with vengeance from the very moment you meet him. Robbed of that moment of vengeance by Paul, who is set to duel another Harkonnen, Fade Rautha, Paul would not leave this final conflict to Gurney, and so him choosing to fight Fade himself, it comes at the expense of his friendship, giving his friend what he wants most. I think that the problem could have been sidestepped entirely if Gurney had actually been given the chance to confront Beast Rabban, who is in this very flippant sentence just described as already dead. The films, I think, handle both Gurney and Beast Rabban specifically, the source of Gurney's malice and hatred, a little bit better. Dave Bautista does a great job as Beast Rabban and gives depth to a character who is really not emphasized in the books almost at all, despite being an integral pawn of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, is not really fleshed out. I really like how in the film they grant Gurney a final standoff with Beast Rabban. Gurney tries to encourage Paul in the novel to not use the family atomics in their final attack on Arrakeen. He has a deep grievance with the Harkonnens, but he at least has the reproach to not want to use atomic weapons. And I think it further highlights Paul's kind of descent into his role that he elects to use the atomics. There's a little bit of shade thrown to Gurney in the adaptation, though. Gurney just mentions, like, I know where you hid the bombs, eager to unleash some atomic warfare on them, while omitting the conflict between Gurney and Jessica, and Thufir and Jessica, is probably a good call in terms of condensing the narrative. It would have, if included, given the characters more to do, and given the dynamic between them a lot more meat. The moment when Gurney realizes he has falsely accused Jessica in the novel of being the traitor, it's very dramatic, and he pleads with Paul to kill him out of shame. This almost Shakespearean moment. These larger-than-life characters consumed in passion. It was quite an emotional little scene, and nothing like that is really present in the film, unfortunately. It also is a really important catalyst to get Paul to take the Water of Life. He needs to know how this raid is going to go. He needs to have the prescience. Wanting that site, not out of conquest, out of a desire to prevent the people he loves from being killed. It makes Paul's sacrifice of his humanity feel motivated by something humane. He's also a lot more flawed, like at the omitted from the film dinner party scene, he takes on this kind of arrogant tone. Jessica noting internally that no one should be feeling this confident when they have to sleep underground out of fear of assassination. A scene that I really enjoyed in the movie up until a point was Paul's final climactic speech to all of the Fremen, but at the climactic moment of this monologue, he has to go up to one of the Fremen and say the line of the movie. I know the real name of this planet, Dune. I finally know what movie I'm watching! A character I wish had been included in the films is Count Fenring, serving as something of a foil to Paul, a contender for the Kwisatz Haderach who didn't make the cut. Paul sympathizing with his enemies. Maybe the only moment, I think, in the whole book where he feels as if his very particular burden is a shared experience. I think it was a shame that they chose not to include that. Other things that I thought were real improvements over the novel were the depiction of Feyd-Rautha. Austin Butler was actually fantastic. One of my favorite performances, along with Rebecca Ferguson as Jessica, who I think is maybe the best casting choice overall. Feyd-Rautha has this like feral animalistic quality in the films that I think better befits his role within the story. I also found the sequence in the gladiatorial arena where he is set to kill a slave for the spectacle of the Harkonnens the most visually distinct sequence in the film. The contrast between black and white is heightened to an insane degree. The fight at the end between Paul and Feyd-Rautha is executed incredibly well. Like the choreography and how it's almost basically silent. It feels very visceral and cinematic. There is a nice parallel between Paul and Feyd going into this final conflict. Both of them, prior in the novel, have one-on-one fights to the death that demonstrate their morality. Paul battling with Jamis, he doesn't want to kill him at first. He stays his hand multiple times because he's never killed a man. Something introduced in Feyd-Rautha's fight is that there are sometimes these code words that can kind of shut down an opponent in the ring, genetically imbued through Bene Gesserit influence, of course, and Feyd uses it to gain the upper hand. Not a fair fight in the least. When they go into this final showdown, Paul is presented with the same information about Feyd-Rautha. Despite how pivotal this final conflict is, Paul refuses to use that as a crutch to gain the upper hand. He defeats Feyd-Rautha by his own merit. A nice little tweak in the movie that I like is that even though Rautha is depicted as a total monster, he chooses to mirror Paul's opening statement, you know, may thy knife chip and shatter. In the arena of mortal violence, Feyd is willing to treat Paul like an equal. Another great sequence in Dune Part 2, Paul has to learn how to ride a sandworm to become a part of the tribe. That was excellent. Very intense, and one that relied very heavily on the visual elements of storytelling. It's pretty much wordless and is this barrage of intense sound and frenetic imagery. Paul first riding a sandworm and Feyd-Rautha's conflict in the gladiatorial arena illustrate the strength of the Villeneuve films. Their visual quality. They have this physicality, this realized texture, a fleshed out environment and soundscape as well. The sound in these movies is incredible. Probably the most realized vision of the world that Herbert has drawn here that we have ever seen before. Casting decisions all across the board were pretty solid, except for maybe Zendaya, who I did not like at all. Chani's role in the film would have been more appropriately diminished were the casting different. The persona and public image of Zendaya is so crucial to the characterization that it sort of draws more attention to the character than I feel is necessary. She mostly seems to be this hyper-competent contrast to Paul, this bumbling outworlder who needs to be taught how to do things, and oh, it's so cute that he doesn't know how to sandwalk, let me show him how to sandwalk. In the novel, Chani actually bonds with Paul over their shared grief, the loss of their respective fathers, Liet Kynes being Chani's father, whereas in the film, Kynes is her mother, and I don't feel the loss of Kynes is really emphasized as much as it should be. Chani is propped up in this film as the only person who sees through the ruse of Paul. In reality, if they had a romantic entanglement, she would be far less objective. Literally the only person in this whole sea of people standing up and taking issue with it. I thought that that image was just absurd. Like, nobody else has made these same observations. She's a northerner, and southerners are the more superstitious type, the more likely to believe in prophecy. I thought that that could have been an interesting way in actually fleshing out the Fremen culture, which I don't think is communicated in the books. I don't believe there's this northern-southern divide, at least as it relates to the prophecy. And that could have been more compelling if maybe this rejection of the prophecy had actually developed into a faction that Chani was heading herself, making it all the more tragic that she has to oppose Paul, that she is emphasizing dramatized so much really felt like they had to lean into a romance to try to sell this movie as a big space opera with lots of melodrama. Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya, they're just such beautiful people and they love each other. No, it's so tragic. The execution of that was just so terrible. And that gets to the root of my biggest problems with the Villeneuve movies. They are written very badly, actually. I was very surprised how poor the dialogue is, how much has been sacrificed. The countless examples of incredible exchanges between characters, tons of flavor and personality and wit is just so not there in the Denis Villeneuve films. It has almost caused me to retroactively consider if Villeneuve's films have been this poorly written in the past. It has been a long time since I've seen like Sicario and Arrival and Prisoners, all films that I really enjoyed when they came out, but now I'm thinking to myself, he really is a filmmaker who leans into the brutalist visual fidelity of his recent movies, at least. I think that the presentation and the really accomplished sheen might deceive a lot of audience members into not noticing just how bad the writing is. We lose a lot of the psychological depth that makes the book more compelling. Characters, their edges are sanded off. Paul is made more relatable, and his ultimate turn at the end of the narrative is not quite as well communicated. And I think that that's to make this story more digestible, but I think the thing is that Dune is incredible because it's complex. Denis' vision of this story has taken a lot of elements and then just made them kind of dumber. Like, I really encourage you, if you watch these movies again, to pay attention to the dialogue as it is written. A lot of the sequences in the film that are original to it have just such shitty Hollywood dialogue and really bad, limp, lazy jokes to try to bring some levity to the story, which I don't think really needs it. They have tried to make the world of Arrakis this perfectly palatable level of, like, exotic. The heat is so draining on this planet, the Fremen have to move about at night. And there are all of these lunar vistas that are quite beautifully captured in the book, but all of the film takes place during the daytime. That is something that Villeneuve actually could have really captured well. Like, I think that he is someone who captures darkness, like visual darkness, in a way that is simultaneously very clear and also captures the foreboding and ominous elements of a nighttime setting. And that he chose not to do this, I think, is just kind of silly. It actually plays against his strength. His striking imagery in Blade Runner 2049, I think, has a lot to do with the murky atmosphere. My biggest gripe with the Villeneuve films is that they have translated the essence of this work into a blockbuster context, make it a profitable venture. And so there's lots of awesome spectacle. So whenever the films lean into the cinematic language of Dune, I think that it works very well, but the problem is that Dune, the language of the book, is more psychological. It's more about the dialogue, and that is where the Dune films, I think, fail totally. What they have done is effectively capture the plot of Dune. But what they've lost is the story itself. The beat-for-beat things that make Dune fleshed out and psychologically and politically intricate. Those things feel very watered down. In my ideal world, and I know this will never happen, and in any timeline probably would never happen, but I think a filmmaker actually like Terrence Malick would be really well suited to translating this material to the screen because he's not afraid of internal monologue. And this movie is definitely afraid of it, outside of it being an element of sound within a montage. The Villeneuve films also exclude a lot of the thornier elements of the books. Like, I don't think the word jihad is mentioned anywhere in the Villeneuve movies, and it's like the whole thematic crux of these books is the notion of jihad. It makes sense as a business decision, but it's like, come on. It's the whole point. And other things, like how Paul loses his son in order to get him where he is, triumphant over the Harkonnens. These more interesting and provocative things are absent in the Villeneuve films. As a result, I had this pervading sense of hollowness throughout both of the films. I was really surprised and really kind of disappointed as a fan of all of his films prior. Another quirky little element omitted from the film is the orgy that breaks out among the Fremen after Jessica becomes a Reverend Mother. That would have been nice to see on the big screen, doing their utmost to maintain that PG-13 rating. While the violence is often quite brutal brutal in its choreography, the bloodless nature of it does kind of evoke the feeling you get watching Dunkirk. It's kind of this cognitive dissonance. What you're seeing is very intense, but it lacks that crucial realistic consequence of engaging in such violence. A minor nitpick, but one that I really don't like within big blockbuster entertainment. A lot more people are willing to see R-rated movies than studios believe. I don't really think it's a sentence of death the way it has been in the past. I think a lot of things are just not tried out of fear. Although the orgy, I can see why they would cut that. I can see why they would cut that. But the weirdos in the audience were missing out. Dune itself had to be very carefully compromised in order to make it to the zeitgeist the way it has in our current cultural moment. It doesn't result in a movie that I actually really like, and I was sad to come to that conclusion naturally. As critical as I am of these movies, I think I would recommend them to most people. There's a lot to the world of Dune that needs to be fleshed out, that needs to be explained and built up over time, and I think this idea to split the narrative into two films was a wise one to properly capture the essence of the source material. So if anything, I am grateful to these films existing because it spurred me to read this faster than I would have. I would recommend Dune to people who are not normally interested in science fiction. Probably a really good gateway read, something I should have read at least 10 years ago. I will be taking the opportunity to see the 1984 version of Dune helmed by David Lynch. I can't imagine it outmoding these two movies I've already been quite harsh on, but I'm going to leave that review to Future Dan. Take it away. Future Dan here. I have now seen the 1984 adaptation of Dune by David Lynch, and it was an educational watch. More interesting to think about and dissect than to actually experience. A battle between the creative mind of Lynch and the studio backing the film. The manner in which this movie is edited, it feels like two people fighting over the steering wheel of a truck. It's just like this violent jerk from like one sensibility to another. You get the abstract, dreamlike strangeness of Lynch playing out and lingered on for extended periods of time. And then when we have to turn our attention to the story, it moves like a Cliff Notes version of Dune on speed, blazing through tons of different concepts, jumping over entire stretches of story that could have been cool to see play out. There are aspects of this film that I enjoy, ironically. An inexplicable pug that Patrick Stewart as Halleck is just carrying around and holding in his arm as he's charging off to war. Virginia Madsen is like fading out and then fading back in and then fading out and fading back in to give this expository narration. The whimsy of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen after he's defeated the Atreides, whizzing around in the air with the use of his suspensor technology, laughing maniacally. But there are things about the film that I do like. There is an admirable air of mystique that endured into the final cut of the movie that I feel is almost entirely attributable to David Lynch. Characters do deliver their internal monologues as this breathy, almost like ASMR style narration. The depiction of Aaliyah is quite good. The child actor was really cute, and that juxtaposed nicely with the eerie delivery of her dialogue, which was very clearly ADR'd. I also like the design of the sandworms. For the most part, they looked pretty good. They reminded me a lot of the graboids from Tremors. My brother noted that they feel like design maybe out of The Dark Crystal, though whenever a character is juxtaposed against them via green screen, it's very obvious and has not aged well. A lot of the green screen effects have not aged well. Cal MacLachlan was pretty good casting as Paul, though he gives a much stranger and less consistent performance. I think everyone's performance in this movie is like super inconsistent. All of every element of this movie is a byproduct of the production process at war with the director. At times it feels very aimless, and at times it feels really intense to the point of it being over the top. It's a cinematic world with ornate production design, really lavishly decorated sets, and decent makeup that, again, kind of varies from character to character. But there are also parts of the visual design that feel artificial, like a set, and it doesn't feel lived in. It occupies this weird space where some of it is worth lauding, but then it's also got this B-movie quality, kind of like Flash Gordon. There are some really jarring transition shots as well, some that fall in a row almost as if in a montage. The film almost like peels back as if the emulsion is playing out in rapid succession. And I could go on and on about these odd and often unfitting creative decisions, sometimes being interesting despite themselves. I think the whole film, from front to back, could just be characterized as a frustrated movie. And that is most evident in how the narrative plays out. Focusing on some things intensely, omitting things entirely, or brushing past other plot points, or introducing new strange elements that don't quite cohere with what we've seen so far. I can completely understand the frustration of a fan at that current moment feeling like Dune is now permanently unadaptable. One of the greatest creative forces in art house cinema could not realize this film. I have just given up hope that we'll ever see Dune on screen. The benefit of hindsight, though, makes it hard for me to hate this movie. Like, it has a lot of charming qualities, and this might come across as overly contrarian, but I think something this film does have over the Villeneuve movies, it doesn't feel as carefully focus grouped. It's a movie that kind of went off the rails and got out of everyone's hands. This movie had a lot of cultural weight to bear for many years. And now that we have seen the story of Dune, for the most part, captured in a more successful manner, it is very easy for me to distance this adaptation from the source material because of just how wildly it veers off course. It's not a good film in any traditional sense, but there's value in it. The alternate vision it represents shows that Dune, the story, at least in a cinematic context, is not set in stone. It is an interpretable work. Film, being such a collaborative medium, is heavily dependent on these elements of filmmaking all coming together in the right conditions. Dune 84 is proof positive of this idea. I don't think that Dune 84 is up for like a huge critical reappraisal. It is absolutely a mess, and a fun one. And one that I think is probably my least favorite film from Lynch that I have seen so far. So it does make it easy on anyone putting together a David Lynch tier list what will occupy the bottom slot, but it's not a wretched film. It's not a malicious movie. It's simply an overwrought creative misfire that does have lessons to teach by its own existence, if not in the mechanics of its actual storytelling. A little note of irony to keep in mind is how Herbert's own influence within the world of science fiction negatively impacted the first adaptation of Dune. His novel clearly being an inspiration for movies like Star Wars, the first film adaptation of Dune trying to capture the magic of something like Star Wars, and yet that approach so coloring this movie sabotaged it greatly. I was reading the novel while donating plasma, and another donor noticed I was holding a copy of Dune, and he was a huge fan. He told me all about the series and the books written by his son and how they're not as good. He also told me about a miniseries by the Sci-Fi Channel back in the early 2000s, and he attested that it was a pretty faithful adaptation, but one that had a more cheap visual presentation and thus doesn't really garner as much critical affection as these newer movies. I don't think I'm going to watch the miniseries. After reading the novel and watching 3 different Dune movies, I've got Dune fatigue, so for the time being, I'm good on all things Dune. Even if it is a true adaptation, I just don't care anymore. I'll let the Dune fans champion that miniseries. I'm good. The book is good. You should just read the book. That's the best advice I could give to anybody. Just read the book. Just read the book. Thanks for that, Future Dan. We were all craving that added context. You're welcome. And might I say, one day, though separated by the gulf of time, I will kill you, for there can only be one Dan. I really appreciate you all watching these reviews. It's taken up a lot of my time and energy while I've got other things going on. I'm really glad I've been able to maintain it. I hope I do not falter. I am this early into the challenge already expressing uncertainty as to whether or not I'll be able to maintain the weekly schedule, but it has been very good for me as motivation to both read and do video projects. On your end, thank you for watching.